In the Bible, no one seems to think that God's existence, indeed the existence of a loving God, is somehow incompatible with suffering. Premier Christian Radio in the UK just did a survey about religious attitudes in the wake of COVID, and I found it kind of interesting. They came to a number of conclusions, but the one that got my attention was 67% of people that call themselves religious said that their belief in God was challenged by the COVID emergency, by this time of suffering. Now, in one sense, of course, I get it, this age-old problem of trying to reconcile God's existence with the fact of suffering. You see it in a lot of different philosophers. I would say in every debate I've ever had with atheists, agnostics, and naturalists, this will come to the fore. And well, how can you believe in a God of love if there's so much suffering in nature and in human experience, et cetera? So, of course, in one sense, I get it. God and the Holocaust, God and pandemics, God and tsunamis. How do you reconcile them? But here's what I want to share today, because I think we don't emphasize this enough. In a way, this problem is anomalous. We might understand it coming out of a philosophical perspective, but it really is not a biblically informed perspective. What I mean is, in the Bible, no one seems to think that God's existence, indeed the existence of a loving God, is somehow incompatible with suffering, even innocent suffering. Nobody in the Bible says, well, this is an insurmountable philosophical difficulty. No, it's more or less taken for granted that God's loving existence is compatible with suffering. Now, examples abound. In fact, it's almost impossible to find a counterexample. Noah, whom God clearly loves, but Noah goes through the incomparably difficult ordeal of the flood. Think of Abraham, God's very specially favored son, and yet Abraham is called upon by God to make this horrific sacrifice. Now, God stops him at the last second, but he calls upon him to make the sacrifice of his own son. Think of Moses, whom God clearly loves, and the terrible sufferings and ordeals that Moses has to go through. And then at the end of his life, Moses is refused access to the promised land. Think of David, the sweet singer of the house of Israel, a man after God's own heart. And yet David is punished in all sorts of ways and has to go through terrible sufferings. Most broadly speaking, Israel, God's chosen people, the apple of his eye. Israel, the priestly nation, the people set apart, the ones whom God specially loves. Israel goes through terrible sufferings, exile and deprivation and slavery. You see my point? And, from a Christian standpoint, all this culminating in the only begotten Son of God, who at the end of his life endures the horrific suffering of the cross. The point is, from beginning to end of the Bible, you don't have a great philosophical dilemma between how could God exist and there be evil. In fact, it's kind of taken for granted. Now, do the biblical authors propose some, rationale for this? Yeah, at times. Sometimes they'll suggest that we suffer as a result of sin. Maybe God allowing us to feel the effects of our sin. Indeed, the prophets will see it as punishment for sin. Other times, suffering might be seen as a way of, purging a person or moving them to a deeper place in the spiritual order as a kind of purification. Sure. I'd say more often than not, the biblical authors say, I just don't know how this suffering fits into God's providential designs. Now, you want the details? Go to one of the most powerful books in the Old Testament, the book of Job, which is all about this theme. Job going through terrific suffering. Job, who again, especially favored, adept of God, a devotee of God, loved by God, yet goes through terrible suffering. When Job calls God into the dock, what does God say? But Job, where were you when I made the heavens and the earth? Where were you? You know? In other words, I don't know. I don't know how this fits into God's providential plan. But here's the interesting thing. Job doesn't think for a second that his suffering somehow disproves the existence of God or disproves the love of God. What Job does do is he laments. He does indeed complain. But see, mind you, he laments precisely to the loving God of Israel. He brings his complaint precisely before God. He's not stuck on the horns of a philosophical dilemma. Either God exists or there's no suffering. No. He laments to the God of love, whose ways and purposes he just doesn't understand. Now, go back to what I said at the very beginning. I get the philosophical problem. It comes up all the time. I get naturalists and atheists today who bring this up. But I wonder if part of the blame has to be placed on us religious people, on us religious teachers who've been particularly bad at presenting the God of the Bible. I mean, maybe to a philosophical conception of God, this poses an enormous, insuperable problem. But the God of the Bible, I don't think this poses an insuperable difficulty. It's more or less taken for granted. I wonder if we, religious types, have been seduced more by an abstract philosophical idea of God, and we've been pretty bad. Jacob, again, especially beloved by God. And yet, at this key moment in his life, Jacob wrestles all night with God. And at the end of the struggle, he's wounded, indeed permanently wounded. Now, that's a biblical metaphor. Not to say, oh, because I suffer, I deny God. No. Rather, enter into the lists with God. Wrestle with God, struggle with God, seek to understand. Yes, even when that struggle itself wounds you. Lament, complain, yes, indeed. But don't give up on God. Enter into the struggle with him. And again, maybe lastly, going back to Job, who complains to the loving God of Israel. Okay, I get it. Look, anyone over the age of 10 has suffered. I've experienced suffering that I don't understand. Trust me when I tell you, in my prayer, I often complain and lament the way Job does. So no problem with that. I have no quarrel with that. But then we shouldn't just let ourselves off the hook too easily and say, well, therefore there's no God. No. Complain all you want. But then, everybody, let's have the humility to listen to the voice that comes out of the whirlwind. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Aquinas says the foundation for moral reasoning is do good, avoid evil. Seek one of the basic goods and avoid a violation of the basic goods. You might put it that way. Now, Thomas names them, and Finis is based on this. Thomas names them as existence, life, society, and God, a relation to God.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director here at Word on Fire. Joining us from the Santa Barbara studio is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, always good to see you.
Hey Brandon, how you doing?
Doing well. Listen, we got a lot to talk about today. We're going to be discussing Catholic Morality 101. What are the main moral systems people accept today? How should Catholics understand them? Which ones are acceptable? Which ones aren't? All of that is coming your way soon, but before we get there, Bishop, last episode, you told us about this series of books you were reading by Robert Alter that were commentaries on the Old Testament. Anything else you're reading? What else you got?
Well, for fun, it's my moment for really big books. I'm reading Ron Chernow's biography of Grant, Ulysses S. Grant. I never read Chernow before. He wrote the big biography of Washington and then the famous one of Hamilton, and the musical is based on that. Well, I just got this one on Grant. It's really good. I'm a big Civil War buff. I love Lincoln, and I'm about a quarter of the way through it. It's about 1,000 pages. So I read it before I go to bed at night, and it's literally hard to hold up in front of me as I'm reading. But it's really good, so I'm enjoying that.
We need to get you like a Kindle. It's for those types
You know,
of books
I
where you're
don't
not
like Kindle,
taking
though.
notes.
Yeah, I guess, but I just don't like it. I don't know. I'm old-fashioned.
All right. Well, as I said, we're going to be talking about morality here in this episode. And no surprise to anyone, our culture holds a wide range of different moral views and systems. In this episode, we're going to look at 3 of the major ones, 3 that I think have the best representation in our culture today. The first one, and you might say is the most prominent one, Bishop, we can get into that here in a moment, but it's consequentialism. Consequentialism holds that the moral worth of an action should be judged by its consequences. So a good or a right situation is one that produces mostly good consequences, and vice versa. The best known form of consequentialism is known as utilitarianism, where again the actions are judged based on how much happiness they procure for sentient beings. The number of beings that can think and reason and feel and experience. We want to maximize happiness for those types of beings. So, Bishop, maybe give us a little more background on consequentialism, and then especially for Catholics, what are some problems that we see with this system?
Yeah, as you suggest, Brandon, it's an old system. It goes back a long way. And you think about systems that endure over a long period of time, there's something right in them, or they wouldn't have endured that long. So I would never want simply to dismiss, a system that I find inadequate. They've got something positive, and that's why they've endured. I would say, too, a lot of people instinctually think along consequentialist lines, even if they're not real reflective about how they're doing moral, philosophy. They probably instinctually follow that sort of model. Like, okay, I do this, and this happens, and that happens, and well, which one is better? And here's the basic problem. The problem is it brackets the category of the intrinsically evil act. So in a strict consequentialism, and when I was going through school, what was kind of dominant even in Catholic circles was a form of it called proportionalism. The idea here is that you perform an act, it has both good and bad consequences, and what you do is you try to find what's the relationship between those. Is there a proportion between the good to be attained and the evil that happens? And you weigh them. You look at them and say, well, okay, if the good outweighs the evil, then that's a morally legitimate act. If the evil outweighs the good, it's a bad act. As I say, there's something, we think instinctually, yeah, that seems right. The problem, though, is, aren't there some acts that are simply wrong, no matter what the consequences are? So you say, well, yeah, if I do this, all kinds of good things are going to happen as a result. I do this, yeah, a lot of good consequences, only a few bad ones, so yeah, it must be okay. An intrinsically evil act is an act that by its very nature is so repugnant to the good and to human flourishing that it can never be justified by appeal to any consequences. And see, Catholic moral theology, we'll get there in a little bit, but insists upon this act. And I've always felt, Brandon, that without the category of the intrinsically evil act, the moral project goes adrift. That's to say, if someone's, clever enough, they can justify pretty much anything. Why couldn't you say, for example, to attain the goal of the political revolution, well, yeah, sure, 1 million people had to die, but that's the price you pay because the good of attaining the revolution outweighed the evil. A second problem is, who's making these judgments? So you look at an act, I look at an act, you say, oh yeah, that's good, evil, and okay, that's about 65% versus 35%. Who's deciding? Who's deciding what the right relationship is? And then another problem is the incommensurability of these consequences. How do you gauge, how do you measure the value of this versus the disvalue of that? you look at incommensurable consequences, and it's like, apples and oranges. How do you possibly make that adjudication? But the basic problem, I would say, is the suspension of the category of the intrinsically evil. Once that goes, the moral enterprise becomes very, very unmoored and therefore dangerous.
Let me throw at you the age-old scenario that college students taking Ethics 101 receive mostly on day one. It's the trolley problem. So you got this trolley train, it's on a runaway track, and it's heading toward a group of 5 people who are maybe tied to the track. It's going to run them over and kill them if you do nothing. But there's a lever you're standing next to, and you have enough time that if you pulled the lever, the train would be diverted to another track, but there's only one person on that track. If it runs over that track, it'll only kill one person. So the ethics professor put it to their students, what do you do? Do you do nothing and let the train kill the 5 people? Do you pull the lever and kill the one? Both seem like bad options. What does a Catholic priest and philosopher say to this situation?
Well, you have to assess first the nature of the act. Are we dealing with an act that by its very nature is intrinsically evil? And so in that case, we have to do a little more thinking that through. There is a category within Catholic moral theology called the double effect. The double effect would allow for an act that does have a negative consequence, and it would be permissible under certain circumstances. Namely, if the act in itself is not intrinsically evil, if the evil effect is not intended, and if there is some proportion between the evil consequence and the good consequence. So in that sort of scenario, one could allow for an act that produces certain negative consequences, but only under those strict conditions. There's an example of that I've always found intriguing as a film buff. One of my favorite films in recent years is called Master and Commander. Remember the one with Russell Crowe, and it's early 19th century British ship, and they're in a storm, and one of the masts is broken and fallen overboard, and there's this sailor kind of clinging to it. And for navigational reasons I won't go into, it becomes clear that unless they cut that mast free, the whole ship's going to go under. Well, the captain knows that if he does that, that sailor is going to die. There's no way he can be saved. Well, he does it. Now, how would you analyze that act? You could say, well, cutting the mast free from a possibly sinking ship is not intrinsically evil. The captain didn't intend the death of the sailor, and he looked at the consequences. If he cuts it away, this one sailor will die. If he doesn't cut it away, the entire ship will go under. And so there is indeed a proportion there of good versus evil. In that scenario, that act would be seen as permissible. But see, in a strict consequentialism, you bracket the question of the intrinsically evil. You simply look at the calculus of good and evil consequences, and that has all the problems we just named. But see, Catholic moral theology does, if you want, include a kind of consequentialism, but only under that rubric of the double effect.
All right, let's move from consequentialism to another major prominent form of morality, and that's deontological morality, or sometimes called legalist morality. So this comes from the Greek word dion, which means obligation or necessity or binding. Generally, these words refer to duties. So this would be a moral system where you have a long list of moral duties, things that you should do, and then concomitantly things you should not do. So here are all the good behaviors, here are all the bad behaviors. Sometimes this gets caricatured as just legalism. You've got 2 lists, and what matters is just following those lists. How should Catholics understand this type of morality?
The great figure here is Immanuel Kant, is the best representative of a deontological ethic. Kant says famously, the only thing that's good in an unqualified way is the good will. And that gives away the game for Kant, that it's the will that has properly ordered itself toward the moral good that is unqualifiedly good. Consequences, motivations, what's in it for me, any other circumstance is finally irrelevant to that fundamental interior move of the will. So Kant would say in the famous categorical imperative, the maxim of your will should always be congruent with a universal law. That's an abstract way of putting it. That means as I'm about to perform a moral act, I must act in a way that the maxim for myself should be a universal law. It would apply to everybody. What I can't do is say, oh yeah, well, lying is wrong, but under these circumstances, I will lie because it'll have these effects, or because I'm under this pressure, or because it'll produce these good consequences. No, you must always act such a way that the maxim of your will should become a universal law. That's a formulation of a purely deontological ethic. Now, something valuable about it, yeah, there is something kind of noble and austere about deontology. What's the concern? There's also something that's so abstract and inhuman about it, because it abstracts from the particular situation, as though anything like circumstances or consequences are irrelevant to moral determination. And Catholic moral theology would not move in that direction. What it has in common with deontologism, I think, is the stress upon the intrinsically evil act. But it doesn't do it in this austerely abstract Kantian way that completely marginalizes circumstances and consequences. That's a schematic way of putting it.
All right, let's move to the third and final system I want to talk through with you, and I want to spend a good deal more time on this one. It's known as virtue ethics, and it's tied closely to natural law morality, which I want to discuss too. Rather than me defining it, how about you give us a definition of both of these things, natural law and then virtue ethics, which flows from natural law?
Yeah, good. I think natural law ethics are grounded in a sense of the basic goods. I'm using a term there from John Finnis. When I was going through school, there were competing approaches to morality, but we read John Finnis's famous book, Natural Law and Natural Right. And Finnis, basing himself on Aquinas and the great natural law tradition, articulated this way. There are, he thought, 7 basic goods. These are values, to use Dietrich von Hildebrand's language. These are values that appear within nature, within human experience. I won't get them all right. Whenever you try to do a list, you'll miss some, but it's life, knowledge, play, religion, sociability, practical reasonableness, and again, I think, did I say art or beauty? 7 incommensurate, irreducible, basic goods that appear within the framework of our experience. What's a good act? A good act is one that achieves or integrates one of the basic goods. Think of here Thomas Aquinas, who said the first principle of the moral life is do good and avoid evil. You say, well, duh, that's rather obvious. But in the same way that the principle of non-contradiction, you say, well, duh, a thing cannot be and not be at the same time in the same respect. But that's the foundation for all reasoning, right? If you don't accept the principle of non-contradiction, you can't reason mathematically or in science or any other way. So in a similar way, Aquinas says the foundation for moral reasoning is do good, avoid evil. Seek one of the basic goods and avoid a violation of the basic goods. You might put it that way. Now, Thomas names them, and Finnis is based on this. Thomas names them as existence, life, society, and God, a relation to God. For Finnis, that's religion. He expands Aquinas a little bit. Okay, now, once you know the basic goods, and at the point of the moral life is to seek them and to avoid violating them, now what? Well, here's where virtue ethics comes in. Now, try to inculcate in yourself and in others, so you're father of young kids, so you're very interested in this. Inculcate those habits which will become so ingrained in myself and others that make the attainment of the good first possible and then effortless. Now, this is Aristotle. This goes way back. Habituate yourself and others to the good so that these now become ingrained habits, dispositions. Those ingrained habits and dispositions toward the good we call virtues, right? And so a whole theory now of virtue ethics coming up out of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas has been re-expressed. Think now of someone like Alistair MacIntyre in our time. Very much correlated to the natural law. I think, Brandon, from a theoretical and practical standpoint, it's a very useful way to think about the moral life. as I say, you as a parent are very interested in the proper inculcation of habits in your kids, that they're not meant to oppress them, like let me lay the law on you. They're meant to ingrain in them the habits that will make them happy. I'll give you one example. So John Finnis will claim that knowledge is a basic good, right? I think it's fair to say, because I'm not going to brag about my own moral life too much, trust me, but I'll brag a little bit that I think, for all kinds of reasons, I got habituated very well toward the basic good of knowledge. I love to read. I love to have intellectual conversations. I love writing. I love the life of the mind. We just talked about all the books I'm reading. Well, where'd that come from? That came from parents and teachers when I was a little guy, learning how to read, and then, putting in me the disposition toward achieving that good. I've got that virtue in me, if you want, so that attaining the good becomes something easy for me. And that's true. I don't fight that at all. I don't struggle against that. Like, oh, I got to read a book, and oh, God, please. No, I happily do that. Now, take all the basic goods toward God, toward friendship and sociability, toward the arts, and place in us and in our friends and children those habits that create the virtues that make the attainment of those goods possible. That's a natural law of virtue ethic, if you want.
It seems to me, both as a parent and just in my own life, that virtue ethics is more attractive and effective if our goal is to condition kids or ourselves toward the good. Like your example you just gave of reading books. On the consequentialist system, you would think, well, if I learn to read heavy books, what are the benefits? What are the drawbacks? And maybe I'd kind of weigh those proportionally and make a decision. Or on the deontological view, it's like, well, here's a rule. You should read books. This is what our teachers in schools tell us. And look how many kids rebel against that sort of demand. But then virtue ethics is like, well, the kind of person that I hope to become requires stimulating the mind and the intellect and reading books. And I think parents get that more deeply, that like flat rules don't really work. Helping like a young child to weigh future consequences is never going to work, but helping them to become the person they want to be is more attractive.
Well, I'll say something else too, Brandon, against the consequentialist view. Finnis, for example, will say, one may never intentionally attack a basic good. That's his way of stating what's an intrinsically evil act, right? Let's take the basic good of life. So are the basic goods to some degree in competition, and I can't do them all at the same time? Yeah, okay, sure. But what can't you ever do? You can't intentionally and directly attack a basic good. So I'm gonna abort this child because I think certain goods are gonna come from it. Well, no, I don't care what goods could possibly come from it. You can't directly attack a basic good. I'll give you another example, maybe out of that realm. The basic good of art or beauty, which Finnis recognizes. Remember a couple years ago when the Taliban was in charge, in Afghanistan, and they were intentionally destroying those ancient works. I think they were Buddhist statues, right? Now, well, to achieve our goals, to make our country more authentically, religious, or whatever the reason given, what were they doing though? They were intentionally and directly attacking the basic good of the beautiful. I think here too of Malcolm Miller, the great tour guide at Chartres, whom I heard many times. And Miller said one time in a lecture, I get that all religions need to be reformed. They all do. Ecclesia semper reformanda, right? But he said, the clearest indication that a reform has gone off the rails is when people start destroying beautiful things. Well, yeah, I'd say that's right, because destroying beautiful things on purpose, directly attacking them, is intrinsically evil. World War II was a terrible thing, and to bring the Germans to their knees, we firebombed Dresden and Frankfurt and Cologne. Look at those photographs sometime if you want, of an entire city leveled, hundreds of thousands, men, women, children, killed. Justifiable? No way, no way. Even if you say, hey, well, wait a minute, think of the lives we saved, think of the good of the war coming to an end. Well, yeah, sure. But you directly and purposely attack the basic good of life. So that's what's missing in a consequentialist form of moral reasoning, very much present in a basic goods or natural law approach.
It's hard to identify like one Catholic moral system, but I think it's safe to say that this sort of natural law virtue ethics is the most consonant with Catholic morality, at least more so than the other two systems we've discussed. And we've certainly seen a revival of virtue ethics after the Second Vatican Council. I'm thinking here especially of Pope John Paul II and his encyclical Veritatis Splendor. His writings on moral theology all but endorse this system. The Catechism of the Catholic Church seems pretty explicitly in favor of it. It says virtue is a habitual and firm disposition to the good. It allows a person not only to perform good acts, but to give the best of himself, which is the virtue ethics conception. Talk a little bit about this revival of the last, say, 50 years of virtue ethics, and who are some of the key figures writing about it today?
Start with John Paul, and you're right, Veritatis Splendor. In my judgment, the greatest of his encyclical letters, of the enormous magisterium of John Paul II. I think it's the greatest of his letters. I love the fact Stanley Hauerwas, the Methodist theologian, said when he read Veritatis Splendor, how wonderful that a Catholic Pope is beginning an encyclical on the moral life with the Bible. And so John Paul begins not with abstract principles, he begins with the story of the rich young man. And see, it fits perfectly, because the rich young man is what? Someone who's seeking the good, right? Good teacher, what must I do to attain eternal life? Good. It's someone seeking the good. And so John Paul takes that as the beginning of his reflection on the moral life. Someone who influenced him very much, and in my judgment, the greatest moral theologian since Vatican II, just recently died a few years ago, a Dominican priest named Serve Pinckaers, who taught at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. Pinckaers, in his wonderful text, Sources of Christian Ethics. I always get that title wrong. Sources of Christian Ethics. He said, remember that Thomas Aquinas, in the Prima Secundae, that means the first part of the second part of the Summa, dealing with the moral life, doesn't get to law until question 90, right? So in a way, take that Immanuel Kant. He doesn't get to law until question 90. What does he begin with? Beatitudo. Happiness. What makes me happy? He begins with the Beatitudes of Christ. What are the goods that will make me happy? Then he moves to the habits and the virtues that will orient me toward those goods that will make me happy. Then he gets to law, because law is meant to give form to the habits, which then give form to the virtues, which then allow me to attain the good. But don't, Aquinas and Pinckaers and John Paul would all agree, don't begin with the law. That's, how many people say, oh, the Catholic Church imposing all these laws on us. No. The Catholic Church begins with joy, beatitudo. It then moves to virtue, to habit, and then to virtue, and then it gets finally to law. That's a good way to do it. That's a good way to approach it. Begin with the rich young man. Master, good teacher, what must I do? So I'm seeking the good. Show me how, right? And now follow that. It's so illustrative. Jesus says, well, you know the commandments, right? The laws, which are meant to habituate you toward virtue, toward the good. You know the commandments. Yes, I do, and I followed them all since I was a kid. And I didn't believe them. I have no reason not to believe them. Okay, then you're ready, kiddo, for the high-octane stuff. What are the Ten Commandments? I mean, that's the basics, if you want. Right? What's going to orient you toward the good? Well, I mean, you got to stop, some of these egregious violations of love. I mean, of course you got to honor your parents. Of course you got to stop stealing, and of course you can't be murdering people. And what I'm saying? The Ten Commandments, that's the bottom line in a way. It's like if you're learning football, it's the 3-point stance. It's how to block and tackle. It's like the fundamentals. Hey, I learned those since I was a kid. Good. All right. So now we're ready for serious stuff. Or you're at basketball camp as a sixth grader, and you're learning how to dribble and learning how to, the basic form of shooting. And hey, I've been doing that now for years. All right, good. Now we're ready for, Michael Jordan. Now we're ready for the serious stuff. And that's why the Lord says to the rich young man, sell all you've got, give to the poor, and come follow me. So now maybe you're ready for the serious life of real discipleship. And of course, famously, the rich young man balks. And no, I can't do that, because he was very rich. Well, that's how John Paul begins that encyclical. Beautiful, beautiful, exactly right. Begin with the desire to be happy, the desire for the good. And then the church, which as Paul VI said, is an expert in humanity. We got 2,000 years of reflection on what helps you to attain that good. Then off you go. And don't settle for, hey, I follow the Ten Commandments. Well, great. I mean, I hope so. I'm glad. Now, hitch your wagon to a star. Now try to live as a saint. Now we're talking. So I would put Catholic morality in that framework. It's trying to orient us toward being a saint.
I've often liked the analogies you've used when talking about virtue ethics that appeal to both sports and music. So with sports, you use like the baseball analogy that when you're trying to get a young kid to fall in love and develop the habituated skills needed for baseball, you don't like give them the 300-page rule book of all the ins and outs of baseball.
Yeah. No, quite right. And you know that, Brandon, from your background playing basketball. And great coaches know that too, don't they? The coach knows how to draw a kid into the world of basketball, into the moves of basketball, and helps the kid to see that the rules are his friend, not an imposition, but the rules are what are freeing him, right? Think of young Michael Jordan, when he was learning basketball, and coaches, good coaches clearly, were placing within his body the moves of the game. Now, in time, he became a Rembrandt. He became a master that kind of redefined the rules in some ways. But heck, he began with the inculcation of habits, which led to virtues, which led to the attainment of the good. And then in his case, he's a kind of saint of basketball, if you want. Now, I'm not making Michael Jordan a saint. Don't misunderstand me. He's kind of like he's a hero of the basketball world. Now put it in the moral framework. Same thing. Teach kids the basics, and that's where the commandments come in. Or it's you don't steal. Come on, one of your kids, one of your little people is stole something from his sister. Hey, come on, you don't do that. Now he might not understand all the implications and what you're trying to do, but you're trying to place in him habits that will eventually lead him to a great act of self-surrendering love, right? But you're not going to get anywhere near that if you're doing things like stealing, from your innocent sister, or if you're bad-mouthing your friends. Why are you telling lies about your friends? Why are you bad-mouthing? Don't bear false witness. So try to eliminate. You're playing basketball. Like, man, you can't dribble looking at the ball. Okay, stop that. You're never going to be able to play looking at the ball. I remember my coach when I was a little kid. Putting this device that stuck out under our eyes so we couldn't see the ball. And it was meant to inculcate the habit of dribbling without looking at the darn ball, Well, that's what the commandments are like, aren't they? They're these restrictions. They're not meant to limit our freedom. They're meant to open up our freedom.
Well, to use a Bishop Barron phrase, we've barely scratched the surface here. This would require a full graduate course to get into all the details of Catholic morality. But Bishop, if people want to go a little further, I'm guessing at least the Survey Pinckaers text, the Sources of Christian Ethics, and then John Paul's Veritatis Splendor. Anything else you'd point people to?
Start with those. Start with Veritatis Splendor maybe, and then go on to Pinckaers' text, I think, is the best way to get oriented. If you want to go really high octane, start looking at Alistair McIntyre, look at Stanley Hauerwas, who's doing virtue ethics too, not from a Catholic perspective, but they'd be in that school.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. If you have one, you can send it in to us by visiting askbishopbarron.com. That's the website where you can record your question. Every episode we take at least one. And today we have a good one from a young man in Los Angeles. He's a big member of the Word on Fire Institute, reading the Word on Fire books, and he's wondering how to help somebody after they've been evangelized. So here's his question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Caesar from Los Angeles. I've been a member of the Word on Fire Institute pretty much since it started. I've read Centered, the book on the spirituality of Word on Fire. That's great. I feel like a lot of what we do is centered about winning hearts over for the kingdom. But what happens when they're already won over? They're ready to go. They understand. They believe. What's the Word on Fire approach to growing inward and growing close to our Lord?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's like what I was describing from the rich young man, as he said to the Lord, yeah, I got the basics in place. And then the Lord says, oh. Peace be with you. Friends, our readings for this weekend are of extraordinary importance. They have to do with, to give it its technical term, Christian anthropology. That's to say who we are in the presence of God, and the Christian understanding of marriage. These two issues are of enormous significance in our culture today. And so this brief passage from the Old Testament, from the book of Genesis, and our brief passage from the Gospel warrant close attention. The opening line now of our reading is well known. The Lord God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone." It's one of the most basic statements of biblical anthropology. It's not good. So God has created Adam, but he says it's not good for the man to be alone. That we belong in society, in community, that we belong together is a fundamental intuition of a biblical anthropology. And here's why it's interesting. Because modern philosophical views are predicated really on the opposite assumption, that we're dealing first and foremost with individuals. Think of political theories coming from Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, the people that influenced our founding fathers. You begin with the individual and his rights. Then individuals come together in a somewhat artificial way to make a social contract. And by means of that contract, they have a kind of shared life. That's not the Bible. The Bible doesn't begin with the individual and his rights. The Bible begins with community. It's not good for the man to be alone. It's interesting to me, too, there's a correspondence between the Bible here and ancient philosophy. So Hobbes and Locke inform the modern view. But go back to someone like Aristotle. He defined the human being as the zoon politikon, the political animal. Well, you know what that means? That means the animal that lives in a polis, in a city. That means he lives with others, that togetherness is basic to his way of being. Even Aristotle's famous definition of the human being as the zoon logikon. We say rational animal, but logikon, logos, it means tongue, it means speech. It means the animal who speaks. Well, see, to speak means to speak to another. To speak means conversation. So in the classical view, both biblical and philosophical, something like community is basic, not individuality. Cardinal Francis George of Chicago used to say, it's making the same point. Catholic social teaching begins not with the individual, but with the family. There's a world of difference there. You're looking at now our political thinking. Don't start with the individual and his rights. But see, that's the dominant view today, isn't it? Individuals clamoring for their rights. But Catholic social teaching doesn't begin there, but rather with the family. It's not good for the man to be alone. Okay, so in accord with this truth, God endeavors to make a partner for Adam. Notice the little prelude, though, it's very interesting, is prior to the creation of Eve, he brings forward before Adam all the different animals, and Adam, one by one, names them. Now, look at it positively first. The church fathers saw this. This is science and philosophy and all the ways that we use our intelligence to catalog the world. That word in English from the Greek, katalogon, according to the logos. So all the animals come before the human being, just as the scientist, the philosopher, names and catalogs and categorizes all things. Beautiful. We're meant to see in this a basic form of human flourishing. But here's the second point, and I might put it a little more negatively. But none of these animals brought before Adam is construed as a proper partner for him. Now notice why. Why? Because all these animals he's able to kind of dominate and master and catalog. If I'm naming them, I'm giving them their names and putting them in their categories, then I'm expressing a dominion over them. Okay, that's appropriate vis-a-vis the other animals. But they're not suitable as Adam's partner. Why? Because they're not co-equal to him. What he needs is someone now who can respond to his intelligence and to his emotion and to his creativity and to his depth of personality. And so we hear that God puts Adam into a deep sleep, and from his rib, he creates Eve. Now, don't read this as a symbol of a woman's inferiority. It's not meant that way, but rather of her radical co-equality. She's not like the other animals that come before Adam, over whom he expresses properly dominion. Rather, now listen, Adam says, "At last this one is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." In other words, my co-equal partner. You know, Aristotle, too, said this long ago, that I can really only have friendship authentically with someone who's my co-equal. Someone whose gaze meets my gaze, whose intelligence meets my intelligence, whose curiosity meets my curiosity, whose capacity for love meets my capacity for love. It's only with an equal that I can be friends. Well, here now, talking about basic anthropology, but now we begin to speak of a biblical theology of marriage. Listen. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two of them become one flesh. I don't know about you, but I don't know anywhere in the literature of the world that the meaning of marriage is better expressed than in that line. The two of them become one flesh. Now, it certainly signals the physical facticity of the sexual act, but see, for someone in the biblical context, flesh didn't mean something opposed to spirit. Flesh meant the person, meant me. The two of them become one flesh means the two of them fuse in such a deep and thorough and complete way that their friendship comes to fullest possible expression. It's not good for the man to be alone. He needs an equal. He needs a friend. And then in marriage, in this relationship of marriage between a man and a woman, friendship comes to its fullest expression. The mutuality, complementarity, the play of co-equal friendship reaches its culmination in the context of a married relationship. Beautiful, beautiful. Marriage is the deepest and fullest kind of friendship. Husband says to his wife, "My life is no longer about me." It's a very interesting thing, I think, when young people get married. It's that extraordinary transition from a fundamentally self-regarding attitude, and that's typical of kids, and you know, it's appropriate as far as it goes. Their lives are about them, meeting of their needs. When a man marries a woman, though, he says, "My life is not about me, it's about you." And the woman, by the same token, says, "My life is no longer about me, it's not meeting my needs, it's about you." The two of them become, in this beautiful mirroring way, one flesh. It's not good for the man to be alone. And so God establishes friendship, yes, indeed, but this most extraordinary, intimate type of friendship that we call marriage. That's the biblical anthropology. Now, let's turn to the gospel. It's this very text from Genesis that Jesus cites when he's questioned about marriage and divorce. I know these texts are much talked about today. He's asked about, God's attitude toward marriage and divorce. And we might expect him to soften the teaching or to relativize it. No, on the contrary, he intensifies it. Listen. Therefore, what God has joined together, no human being must separate. He intensifies the teaching about marriage. He intensifies the prohibition against divorce. And he introduces, I'll use again Aristotle's language, he introduces the transcendent third. What God has joined together, no human being must separate. I've spoken about this often before. What makes a friendship long-lasting, durable? Not simply when the two friends love one another. That's essential, of course. But if it's simply the two friends loving each other, that can devolve into a kind of shared egotism. Rather, Aristotle said, a friendship will endure in the measure that together the two friends fall in love with a transcendent third, with some great value that they are both devoted to that transcends the two of them. Together they fall in love with their country. Together they fall in love with wisdom or whatever it is. Well, same principle. What God has joined together, no human being must separate. Who's responsible for this most intimate expression of friendship that we call marriage? Who's responsible for the two of them becoming one flesh? It's not just their mutual love. Oh, they met each other and they found each other interesting and they fell in love and they decided to get married. Well, that's just a purely secular or purely psychological account. The biblical reading is what God has joined together. What did God want from the beginning? It's not good for the man to be alone. God wanted us in community. He wanted us in friendship, and he wanted this most beautiful and most intense form of friendship. See, friends, that's why the church from the beginning has stood so strongly against divorce. Because it's not simply a matter of two people for their own psychological reasons coming together. No, it's a question of God bringing them together. Okay, one last thought as I bring it to a conclusion. How wonderful that this gospel passage about marriage and divorce ends with this. At a time when children were seen as, kind of an annoyance, had no particular social status, children are coming to Jesus and the disciples want to block them. And the Lord says, let the children come to me, do not prevent them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. What's the fruit of this most intimate, abiding, and beautiful form of friendship? Children. Now we have the full picture. Two people falling in love, but yes, under the guidance of God. Finding this friendship that makes them one flesh, and then that in a fruitful way gives rise to children. That's the image, everybody. That's the picture. I do think at a time when this conception of marriage is under assault, it's very important for us to revisit, especially this text from the second chapter of Genesis, to see what God intends in regard to this most beautiful form of friendship. And God bless you. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director here at Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. And joining me, he's in the United States right now, although I think when this episode airs, he'll actually be in Rome for his ad limina visit, is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, good to see you.
Hey, Brandon. Always a joy to see you.
Every month or so, we do one of these big Q&A roundup shows where we just take questions from people all over the place, and sometimes they're themed. We'll take questions from non-Catholics, questions from kids,
Yeah.
But today we're going to take questions from people outside the United States. We're usually
Okay,
pretty
good.
American centric. So this will be an international Q&A. I know we have thousands
Nice.
of people downloading the podcast from other countries. We see them in the stats. So this is our chance to hear from a lot of them and your chance to hear Bishop Barron's answers to your questions. So we'll just dive
Good.
right in. Sound good?
Good.
All right. First question comes from Stephen. He's a seminarian in Indonesia, and he's asking for your advice when it comes to evangelization. Here's Stephen's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Stephen from Indonesia. I'm a seminarian currently on a mission somewhere in Borneo jungle, Indonesia. My question is, how to evangelize in the remote areas where the people were so simple and can't even read the Bible? I'm totally agree with you against the dumbed-down Catholicism, but I'm afraid the people here will not understand nor benefit anything at all if I'm using a high-level language. Thank you so much. God bless you and your ministry.
Oh gosh, well, God bless you and your ministry, which is important, and it goes right back to the beginning of the church, doesn't it? The missionaries going out to people that have not heard the gospel. Keep in mind that many of the first preachers of the gospel spoke to people who couldn't read. I mean, most people in the ancient world couldn't read. Now, Jews would have known the stories of the scriptures and so on, but they also spoke to, think of St. Thomas, according to legend, goes to India with the gospel. And, the vast majority of those people wouldn't have been able to read. They didn't know the story of Jesus at all. Think of missionaries in more recent times going to parts of Africa where people had never heard the gospel at all. Most of them couldn't read. So, I mean, there certainly is a precedent for what you're doing. I would say two quick things. You know more about this than I do, I'm sure. But the very witness of your life, I think, is super important, that they see you, because you've come into their lives now as a representative of Jesus Christ. They'll see in you, in the way you live, in your manner of being, a sign of Jesus. And that in itself evangelizes. Secondly, I just think tell the story of Jesus. Doesn't have to be in fancy theological language, doesn't have to raise every possible question. Tell the story of the dying and rising of Jesus. What he preached, who he was, why he was opposed, why he was brought to the cross, the stories of the resurrection. Tell the kerygma, tell the basic story of Jesus. I think that has what it's always had, a profound evangelical power. Then, build up from there as people find that story intriguing. They want to hear more. They want to ask deeper questions, then follow and go all the way into the heart of theology. But I think beginning with your own personal witness and with a simple telling of the story of Jesus, that's powerful.
It's a great question, Stephen. And Bishop, this is why I love the new media. We're getting a question from a seminarian in Indonesia evangelizing in the jungles of Borneo, asking a question of a bishop in Los Angeles. I mean, that's pretty cool.
It's amazing. And there's the mystical body of Jesus. We're all connected to each other.
All right. Next up, we have a question from our neighbors in the north. This one is Megan in Vancouver. She's got a question about worry and anxiety. Here it is.
Okay.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Megan, and I'm from Vancouver, Canada. My question is, what is the Catholic response to properly dealing with worry and anxiety? This is something that I feel like I'm always trying to overcome. Thanks for all the work that you do. And please pray for the birth of my first child this February 2020. Thanks.
Excellent. Yeah, God bless you. Last episode, Brandon, we talked about Paul Tillich, whom I studied a great deal many years ago. And one of his lines is, finitude in awareness is anxiety. And what he meant was to be finite and to know it is ipso facto to experience fear. The very fact that I came into being and will one day pass out of being without any control over it. Well, that's a source of anxiety. I mean, I don't know when I'm going to die. I could get sick tomorrow. I don't know. I can't control that. The very fact that I live within space and time, Tillich said, produces anxiety. As your, trust me, younger people, as your birthdays kind of mount up as you get through life, every time you have a birthday, I'm that much closer to the end of my life. The fact that I'm in time means I'm finite. Space, it's interesting living out here in California. Space is always threatening. Look, I've had fires have chased me out of my house twice. Mudslide 10 minutes away from here killed 25 people one night. Earthquakes, famine, flood. I mean, our space means that we live in anxiety. Think of your best relationships, but they're fraught with, incertitude. Is it going to continue this way? Will it go wrong? As I move through life, I change, she changes, he changes. The point is, to be finite is to be afraid, And so this side of heaven, we're not going to eliminate fear completely. We just won't. Now, handing that fear over to Jesus Christ, not that it will be immediately taken away, but it will be contextualized and redeemed by him, if that makes sense. Think now of the image of Jesus on the cross, as that's before your mind's eye. What do you see there? Talk about finitude in awareness as anxiety. Think of someone who's hemmed in every possible way, experiencing all the forms of human fear born of finitude. Okay, hand your fear to him. Let that fear be nailed with him to the cross, and then find through him resurrection. So it's not the elimination of fear, it's the contextualization of our fear within the Paschal mystery. That's what a Christian does with fear. Another insight Tillich had, I think, is really right. If we try through political, economic, and whatever other means to eliminate fear completely, we'll make it worse. Now look at the 20th century. All these attempts, if we just have enough of this reform and we just change the politics, that produces more anxiety. So acknowledge it and then hand it over to the crucified Jesus for redemption.
Bishop, among my friends and some of the people I read online who aren't religious, I find that the most common secular way to conquer anxiety and worry is to increase your control over life.
Yeah.
Like if I can cut out all of the variables I don't have control of, this assumption is that anxiety and worry go down. But then I see it among many of my friends, this relentless pursuit of control, which is ultimately impossible, produces itself more anxiety and worry that I can't gain control of all these variables. Do you see that too?
Absolutely. And I'm reminded of, this is a pastoral example from a spiritual director of mine many years ago. He was dealing with a lady who could not get to sleep at night. And it was this mania to control everything, that she was so worried about every aspect of her life and she wanted to get better control over it. So she'd lie in bed at night, which of course is the worst time to think about these things, and trying to get a handle, and she couldn't get sleep. And what he did is he led her through a sort of exercise. He had her say, I am not God. I am not God. And that was the opening of the door that led to greater peace for her, because she realized, look, I'm not God. I can't control my life. I can't. Lord, you can. Only in God is my soul at rest. If I try to produce rest through my own efforts, I'll make myself crazier, more anxious. I'm not God. All right. So Lord, I'm going to go to sleep now and I'll trust the universe to you. And that allowed her finally to get back to sleep.
I hear echoes in that of the 12-step process for Alcoholics Anonymous, that you have to let go, admit your helplessness, and rely on a higher power.
Absolutely. And again, the Psalm, only in God is my soul at rest. That was the point Tillich made too, is that your anxiety won't be solved on this side of the divide. It's only solved in God when you hand your anxieties over to him.
All right, next we turn to a fellow Canadian. Her name is Bridget. She's in Ontario. She's asking a question about purgatory. Here it is.
Hello, Bishop Barron. This is Bridget from Ontario, Canada. I have a friend who is a convert to Catholicism, but still struggles with the idea of purgatory and the idea of whether it was divinely revealed or just an idea of humans. Could you please explain? God bless you and everyone at Word and Fire. Thank you for all you do.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it's a good question. it would take us a long time to answer it fully. I'll say this: there are a couple of scriptural allusions, you might say, to the idea of purgatory. The most famous is Second Maccabees, and then also in 1 Corinthians. You've got a couple citations in the Bible that are pretty clear indicators of what we mean by purgatory. So there is that. There's a scriptural ground. But secondly, I'd say purgatory in its fullness is an example of the development of doctrine, as Newman would call it, beginning with a sort of kernel of revelation in the Bible. Now that kernel grows and develops over time as people continue to think about it and pull out its implications. Newman says that in some ways purgatory is a result of a commonsensical perception, namely that most people we know, most Christians we know, die in friendship with the Lord, but clearly not not saints in the full sense. Remember in Spe Salvi, Pope Benedict says something similar, that just a casual survey would probably reveal that maybe a handful of people go right to heaven, as we say. And he said maybe it's a handful of people, I mean, who knows, but maybe a handful of people would go right to hell. That most people we know, Benedict said, would fall into that huge middle position of, friendship with the Lord, but far from perfect. And so as the theologians reflect on that, wouldn't it make sense to hold there's something like this purgatorial state? That people who die in the state of grace, that means in friendship with God, but yet far from perfect, require some kind of purgation, namely to purge away from them all that does not belong to love, so that they are fit for heaven, which is simply the place of perfect love. So see, to my mind, that makes perfect sense as a development from basic biblical revelation and informed by our religious experience. And I always say, thank God for the doctrine of purgatory. Believe me, as a sinner, I hope, in friendship with the Lord, but a sinner, I'm grateful for the doctrine of purgatory.
Great question. Okay, now we turn to Montana. She is a young woman in Kenya, Africa.
Oh, that's her name. Okay, now we're turning to the state of
Montana. To
Montana.
Montana. Montana in Kenya. She's got a question about how do we evangelize young people about hot button issues without sounding condemnatory or mean-spirited. So here's a question from Montana in Kenya.
Okay.
My name is Montana from Kenya. I wanted to ask how to evangelize to young people about moral issues in a way that doesn't sound preachy. For example, abortion or LGBT rights. To have a healthy discussion and not to just condemn, but to help us see the truth. Thank you.
It's a great question, one that we all wrestle with. I think everyone involved in evangelization and apologetics and preaching, we wrestle with that. Here's the first insight: start positive. And so the culture, I think, wants to lure us onto the ground where we sound precisely as you're suggesting. We sound cramped and crabby and negative and, life denying, there's the church again telling us no. And well, the culture likes that in a way because it makes us look bad. And as I've often said, the church does say no, but it's always a no to a no. Because, in Christ, it's only yes. And the church who expresses the voice of Christ only says yes. When we say no, it's a no to some negativity in the culture. But our basic stance is always yes. So I would suggest begin with and spend a lot of time with what the church is for. So I know people write, but what about my LGBT friends? Well, can we maybe wait a little bit and let me explain what we're for, what we think is a rightly ordered sexuality, Always, 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 we reach out in love to everybody, right? Those that we agree with, those we don't agree with, those who we think have it right, those that don't have it right. So that's a bottom line, always in love, never in hatred. But I would also say, begin with and spend a lot of time with what we're for. And don't succumb to the temptation. Well, tell me now again what you're against. Tell me why you don't like these people. No, what are we for? Here's what the church stands for when it comes to any of the hot button issues. Then once people get onto that ground, your hope might be they'd say, oh, okay, now I get it. Now I see why you're against certain things. At least that would be a better place to start. Always in love, beginning with the positive, I think would be two basic recommendations. What do you think, Brandon? You deal with this issue a lot too.
Yeah, I agree. I tend to think that the kerygma is a better strategy than focusing on the hot button issues, because that's not really evangelization. Evangelization is proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ, not debating the intricacies of moral issues, which you need to do, just not as your leading move, I think.
It's a frustration because I do a lot of this, of course, and when you talk, especially to young people, and let's have a Q&A, almost invariably people begin with, the hot button sexual issues, and a lot of reasons for that. But it's, if you read the scriptures and you see Paul coming into Corinth or into Athens or into, Philippi or Thessalonica, you don't see Paul saying, now, all right, everybody, the first thing I want you to know is, I'm against homosexuality. Paul, in fact, is against homosexual behavior, but you'd never get the impression from his preaching, that's the first thing he wants you to know. The first thing he wants you to know is Jesus Christ risen from the dead, So quite right. That's how we evangelize.
All right, let's move from Kenya to Germany. Germany, we have a question from Adobe, who's asking about different styles of prayer. Here's the question.
Okay.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Adobe, and I listen to you from Germany. So I was having an argument with my boyfriend, and I made the case that every time that you go before God in prayer, you don't always have to go with a request. Sometimes just go in gratitude and praise, and God, who sees the heart, would know that you have forgone asking Him for something, for instead praising Him, and would grant you your heart desires if He so wishes. My boyfriend disagrees and thinks that you should do both all the time. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a good one about prayer. And prayer is, a complex business in a way. This morning, as I do every day, I had a holy hour. So I spent an hour before the Blessed Sacrament. And part of that time I spend praying at least part of my office, which I'm obliged to do as a priest. Pray the rosary usually, or at least part of the rosary, and then I might finish it later. But one way to think about the holy hour is to divide it into sections. And maybe you say, the first 15 minutes, I look at him, he looks at me. The famous line from the Cure of Ars. Maybe it's just simple communion with the Lord. That's all I'm doing. I'm not asking. I'm not really praising yet. I'm just there. I'm just there. As Fulton Sheen said, I'm like a faithful dog, and I'm sitting by the master's feet, and the master's not giving me a command yet, and I'm not asking. I'm just there. Okay. Maybe the next 15 minutes could be a prayer of praise. I praise you, God. Thinking of the Psalms that I pray now as a priest, they're filled with that language. Many of the Psalms are just, Lord, you're really something. Lord, you're great in your power, and you're great in your mercy, and Lord, you're wonderful. And okay, good. I'm just praising the Lord. Maybe the next 15 minutes, all the people. Now, we all have this. I've got a lot as a priest and a bishop. People say, hey, Bishop, could you pray for me? I'm in trouble here. Or Lord, could you ask the Lord to help me? And my kid is sick, and I'm really worried. I'm having surgery. And okay, so now I'm going to spend 15 minutes praying for people. And then maybe the last 15 minutes, ask the Lord what you want. Maybe you want something. Lord, I love you. I praise you. I'm praying for all these people I know. And now finally I come before you with this, request. What you've done there is you've divided the hour into different types of prayer. They're all good. They're all valid. One is not really higher than the other. Call that first part purely contemplative prayer, where you leave aside words and images and requests, and you're just in the presence of the Lord. The other one is a prayer of praise. The other one's a prayer of petition. Good. They're all valid, good types of prayer. And I think take the time, as Thomas Merton said, take the time for all those forms of prayer. Maybe your holy hour, you don't want it to be that structured. You just want to kind of flow from one to the other. Okay, fine. Sheen said that too about the holy hour. A priest said, what do I do during the holy hour? And Sheen said, make the commitment to it, and then don't worry about it. Do whatever you want. Work on your sermon if you want. Okay. Pray the office. Fine. Pray the rosary. Good. Pray for people. All right. Sit in silent adoration. Great. But take the time. I think he and Merton would have agreed on that. Make the commitment, but then engage in a lot of different forms of prayer. So I guess my answer is a big both and or all the above in terms of prayer.
All right. Next up, we have a question from James in Vancouver. His question is going to get your metaphysical gears turning, Bishop. He's asking about God's relation to the universe. Here's his question.
Okay.
Hello, Bishop Barron. This is James from Vancouver. In past videos, I've heard you talk about how God is outside of or can't be considered one item amongst many in the material world. I've also heard you talk about Thomas Aquinas' argument of God as an unmoved mover. How do you reconcile the contradiction between God being not a part of the material universe, but still having an effect on it? Thank you very much.
Yeah, good. Thanks. It's not a contradiction at all. In fact, one implies the other very deeply. Think of, two items in the world. So I got this microphone in front of me, and here I am, and here's the mouse over there. Well, we can, as this gets caught on my watch, we can influence each other in a very limited way. So I speak into this microphone. I can move it around. I can move the mouse. This mouse is affecting my hand as I touch it. Okay, that's a type of actualization of a potentiality in a very limited, mitigated way. That's the way physical objects relate to each other. Now think of something at a higher pitch. So Brandon and I now are talking to each other, and we're having an effect on each other in a much deeper way, because now you're at the psychological dimension or even the spiritual dimension, the exchange of ideas. We're influencing each other in a much higher way. Think now of the way an angel might be able to influence us. We talk about, and this angels both fallen and unfallen, right? Can influence us in this very deep interior way through temptation or through a positive suggestion, etc. The point I'm making here is the higher you go in the level of being, the more intensely involved in another you can be. Now, let's cut to the chase. God, who, quite rightly, you're saying, is not an item in the universe. Like there's the mouse and the microphone and God and me. No, that's not the right way to think about it. I think God becomes one kind of cog in this machine who would have a very mitigated influence on things, right? God is beyond human consciousness, beyond angelic manner of being. God, the sheer act of to be itself, utterly actual, actus purus. That means God can influence universally and with greatest intimacy. So Aquinas says God is in all things by essence, presence, and power, and most intimately so. That's because he's not an item in the universe. He can be that intimately involved in our lives. Furthermore, why we speak, therefore, of God, of course, as the prime mover of objects. Yeah, I couldn't explain this. You can't see it. I'm moving the mouse. You can't explain that without ultimately recourse to God. But I can't explain spiritual movement, spiritual development apart from God. God reaches from end to end mightily, the Book of Wisdom says, and orders all things sweetly. So the extent of God's power, but also the intensity of God's causal influence is because of his unique ontological status. So I'm glad you pressed it, because it's not a contradiction. In fact, it's the opposite of a contradiction. It's one because of the other, if that makes sense.
I think a lot of people, when they think of this interaction between the spiritual world and the material world, have in mind something like Casper the Ghost, who's sort of floating through walls. How does someone like Casper touch a material item or move a material item? Because it just goes through them.
No, but think of it as the spiritual is a more intense form of being. So the Casper thing is a good example, because that's like Casper would just be another kind of item within the empirical realm. Like he's just more ephemeral, or he's more transparent or something. But the properly spiritual means being at a higher pitch of intensity. Thomas uses the example of heat, which I've always liked. That think of God as the fire in itself. And then as things are closer to God, the hotter they become, the more intense. So think of the seraphim, and that the Hebrew there, seraphim, has the sense of those on fire, right? because they're right up against the divine. Then as you go out from that level of intensity, things get cooler, if you want, in their being. Well, the hottest, like a seraph, can have a massive impact, see, because of the intensity of his being. His causality can be that much more intense. God is that whose causality no greater can be thought. God can reach into the deepest intimacy of your life and cause, and again, without interrupting you. See, the way I'm right now moving the mouse, I'm kind of interrupting the mouse. I'm intervening, Well, God can move us in that sort of non-interventionary way, if I could put it that way. He orders all things sweetly, see, not aggressively, not through interruption or intervention, but in the sweetest manner. I think any spiritual person understands this. Those moments in life, and they're kind of rare, but they're like real precious. They're grace moments when you just know, yep, that's the right thing for me to do, and it's like something just opens up, and you just effortlessly move along this path. That's what grace is like, So that's how God exercises causal influence.
All right, I think we got time maybe for one more question. This one is from Matthew in Vancouver. He's asking about your recent appearance on Dave Rubin's show. You've been on there twice, but the more recent one you were on with another guest, Rabbi Wolpe, and it was one of the few moments of disagreement. A lot of the conversation was on morality and religion and spirituality, things you agree on. But then Dave asked you each about the Trinity, and obviously a Jewish rabbi and a Catholic bishop would not agree. But Rabbi Wolpe made an argument explaining why he doesn't think that the Trinity is sound doctrine. So Matthew wants to know how you'd respond to it. Here's Matthew's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name's Matthew. I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia, and I recently watched your video with Dave Rubin and Rabbi Wolpe, and I was wondering if you could talk about his disagreement with the Trinity and how, if God is perfect, or if the Father is perfect, how are there three people? Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you. I remember, of course, the appearance with Rabbi Wolpe. I don't recall the details of the argument he made about the Trinity, but if I'm following your suggestion here, the Trinity would not in any way militate against God's perfection. When I speak of God's perfection, I mean his full actuality, right? As I mentioned before, God is actus purus. There's no potentiality in God that needs to be more fully actualized. That's when I say he's perfect. That has to do with the essence of God. Now, the essence of God is what all three persons have in common. So there's no multiplication of divine essences. There aren't three, as you said, there are three people. That's the wrong way to think about it. As though there's like the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. No, they're not three separate beings. There's one divine essence, which is perfect. Is the Father perfect? Yes. Is the Son perfect? Yes. Is the Holy Spirit perfect? Yes. Because they share the same divine Godhead or essence. The Trinitarian persons aren't separate beings. They are immanent relations within the unity of the Godhead. So the Father gives rise to the Son in the great act by which the Father knows himself. The Son and Father look at each other, and because they're perfect, they share the same essence. They look at each other with a complete love. That shared love is the Holy Spirit. And so the Trinity is not anyway a compromise of the divine perfection. It's if you want to put it this way, it's a concomitant of it. If God is perfect, that means God is fully actual. That means God has mind. If God has mind, God has self-knowledge. If God has self-knowledge, then the knower and the known look at each other with perfect love. That's the Spirit. So in a way, the Trinity is an implication of the simplicity and perfection of God. There's no contradiction there. Now, again, I'd have to look back at the rabbi's argument to see the details of it, but that's how I think Catholic theology would handle that issue.
I think, and we've talked about this, and I think in previous episodes, Bishop Barron, that people sometimes get worried that if you draw distinctions between the three persons of the Trinity, then you're implying that one or more of the persons lack something that the other persons have, and therefore they're not perfect. And I think that's kind of the line of argument Rabbi Wolpe was trotting down.
Right, but that assumes you've got something like numeric differentiation, the way like three beings are differentiated. And that's precisely how they should not be differentiated. The Father, Son, and Spirit are distinct, that's true, but they're not numerically distinct the way three beings are. And that argument about perfection is a valid one when it comes to ordinary being. Like, for example, you and I are distinct. You can very legitimately conclude from that neither one of us is perfect, right? Because
Well, I mean,
if
come on,
I
speak
were
for yourself.
well, you are,
Yeah,
I know.
of course.
But if you were perfect, then you would have my modality of being in its complete sense. If I were perfect, I'd have yours. The very fact that we can say no, we're different means that neither one of us is perfect. So that's a valid argument. But that assumes that we're talking about three separate beings within God, and that's not what we're talking about.
So then would that same reasoning mean that there cannot be more than one perfect God? Would that be right to
Yeah,
say?
quite right. Yeah, absolutely. That's why we speak of the oneness of God. And it's interesting in the creed, the two qualities, before we get to Trinitarian reflection, the two things we know about God is that God is one and God is powerful, right? We believe in one God, the Father Almighty. It's very interesting. But from those two qualities, you can deduce all the other ones. And that's because of the divine simplicity. So what we call the attributes of God are just different ways of looking at the simple nature of God. But yeah, from his unity follows his perfection. Because the two would be irreconcilable. If you had a multiplicity of gods, none of them would be perfect.
Well, thanks so much for all of you from all around the world for sending in these great thought-provoking questions. We'd love some more. And so if you're listening and you're from countries outside the United States, please send in your questions. You can do so at askbishopbarron.com. Also, we're preparing another couple episodes with questions from non-Catholics and questions from children. And so if any of those fit the bill for you, please send those in as well. We've got a handful already, but I'd like to get a bunch more. So again, askbishopbarron.com is where you can submit your question. Also, Lent is right around the corner. It crept up fast this year. It's on February 26th is when it starts. And we'd like to help you have a powerful Lent by sending you a free Lent Reflections booklet. You can find it at wordonfireshow.com/Lent. These booklets contain a gospel reading from Mass each day, followed by a reflection from Bishop Barron. Also, we have reflections on the Stations of the Cross from Bishop Barron inside this booklet. So you get one copy for free. You just cover the shipping and handling, and then you can order a bunch more too if you'd like by visiting wordonfireshow.com/Lent. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week on the Word on Fire Show.